Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Charleston, South Carolina. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching us from and the exact time you are hearing this narration. We are interested in knowing to what places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In 1845, Charleston's cobblestone streets echoed with the sounds of commerce and human bondage. The city's prosperity rested upon the labor of thousands who possessed no legal right to their own bodies, their own children, or their own dreams. Among these souls was a man named Josiah Reed, whose final written words would surface nearly a century later in circumstances that continue to perplex historians and legal scholars alike. The Reed family had belonged to the Whitmore plantation since 1792. 3 generations of Reeds had lived, worked, and died within the boundaries of the sprawling estate that stretched along the Ashley River. Some 15 miles northwest of Charleston proper, the plantation records, meticulously kept by overseer Marcus Whitmore and later discovered in the Charleston County Archives in 1962, paint a picture of a family that somehow managed to maintain literacy despite the laws forbidding enslaved people from reading or writing. Josiah Reed was born in 1822 to parents whose names appear in the plantation ledger as simply Thomas and Mary. Unlike most entries, which listed only first names and approximate ages, the Reed family's records contained unusual notations. Next to each name, someone had penciled small marks that later analysis suggested might have been a crude form of record-keeping, possibly tracking family lineage or skills. These markings would prove significant when the full scope of the Reed family's secret emerged decades later. The Whitmore plantation operated differently from many of its contemporaries. Historical records from the Charleston Historical Society indicate that Marcus Whitmore, who inherited the property from his father in 1838, implemented what he called educational experiments among certain enslaved families. While teaching enslaved people to read remained illegal under South Carolina law, evidence suggests that Whitmore may have turned a blind eye to learning that occurred within specific quarters of his plantation. Josiah Reed grew into a man of unusual presence. According to surviving accounts from other enslaved individuals, whose testimonies were recorded much later by abolitionist groups. Standing over 6 feet tall with calloused hands that spoke of decades of labor, Reed possessed what witnesses described as an uncommon intensity in his gaze. Fellow workers noted that he often spent evening hours alone, seemingly lost in thought, sometimes moving his lips as if practicing words or phrases that only he could hear. In the spring of 1845, something began to shift in the atmosphere of the Whitmore plantation. Several accounts, preserved in letters between local plantation owners, reference unusual tensions among the enslaved population. Food rations were reportedly hoarded. Conversations ceased abruptly when overseers approached, and work songs that had echoed across the fields for generations gradually fell silent. The first concrete sign that something extraordinary was developing came through the observations of Dr. Edmund Thorne, a physician who regularly visited the plantation to attend to the medical needs of both the Whitmore family and their enslaved workers. In his private journal, discovered in 1964 among papers donated to the Medical University of South Carolina, Dr. Thorne wrote of noticing changes in Josiah Reed's behavior during routine medical examinations. Dr. Thorne's entries from May of 1845 describe Reed as increasingly withdrawn, often staring at a fixed point beyond the examination room window. More significantly, the doctor noted that Reed's hands bore unusual ink stains, despite no obvious source of writing materials being available to him. When questioned about these stains, Reed provided explanations that Dr. Thorne found unsatisfactory, mentioning work with berries and tree bark that would not typically produce such consistent markings. The plantation's daily operations continued through the summer of 1845, but underlying currents of tension became increasingly apparent to those paying close attention. Marcus Whitmore's own correspondence, found among family papers in 1963, reveals growing concern about what he termed irregular behavior among several of his enslaved workers, with particular mention of the Reed family. In a letter dated July 15, 1845, addressed to his brother-in-law in Richmond, Whitmore wrote of his suspicions that certain individuals under my charge may possess capabilities that exceed what is generally assumed of their station. He went on to express unease about discovering what appeared to be crude writing materials hidden in the quarters, though he provided no specific details about their nature or origin. As summer turned to autumn, the atmosphere on the Whitmore plantation grew increasingly oppressive. Other enslaved individuals later recalled a sense of anticipation that seemed to hang over the quarters like morning fog over the Ashley River. Conversations occurred in hushed tones, and groups that had once gathered openly for evening meals began dispersing quickly after eating. The Reed family's behavior during this period attracted particular attention from the plantation's overseers. Josiah's parents, Thomas and Mary, were observed engaging in lengthy, whispered conversations with their son, often late into the evening hours. These discussions took place in areas of the quarters that afforded maximum privacy, typically near the small garden plots where enslaved families were permitted to grow vegetables for their own consumption. By October of 1845, several neighboring plantation owners had begun corresponding about similar observations among their own enslaved populations. Letters preserved in various historical collections suggest that word of some significant event or plan had begun circulating through networks that connected enslaved communities across the Charleston region. The exact nature of this communication network remained mysterious to the white population, despite their growing awareness of its existence. It was during this period of heightened tension that Josiah Reed began what would later be recognized as the most significant act of his life. Using materials whose origin remained unknown, he commenced writing what would become known as his final letter. The composition of this document would occupy his attention for several weeks, during which his behavior became even more notable to those around him. Fellow enslaved individuals who were later interviewed described Reed as becoming almost ritualistic in his approach to writing sessions. He would wait until the plantation had settled into the deep quiet of night, then make his way to a location that provided both privacy and sufficient light from the moon or stars. The exact location of these writing sessions was never definitively established, though several witnesses suggested he favored a spot near the plantation's old storage buildings, where thick walls would muffle any sounds. The content of what Reed was writing remained unknown to those around him. He shared no details of his work, spoke to no one about his intentions, and took extreme precautions to ensure that his materials remained hidden from discovery by overseers or other plantation authorities. This secrecy extended even to his own family, who appeared to know only that their son was engaged in some form of written communication, though they seemed unaware of its specific nature or intended recipient. During the final weeks of October 1845, observers noted a marked change in Reed's physical appearance and demeanor. He lost weight noticeably, his clothes hanging more loosely on his tall frame. Dark circles appeared beneath his eyes, suggesting that his nighttime writing sessions were cutting significantly into his rest. Despite these physical changes, he continued to fulfill his daily labor obligations without complaint or obvious difficulty. The approaching end of October brought with it an unusual series of events that, in retrospect, seemed to serve as a prelude to the climactic moment that would define Reed's legacy. A traveling Methodist minister visited the plantation, conducting informal services for both the white family and their enslaved workers. During these services, witnesses later reported that Reed displayed an intensity of attention that exceeded even his normally serious demeanor. Following the minister's departure, Reed's behavior shifted once again. The secretive writing sessions continued, but he began engaging in what appeared to be preparation activities. He was observed cleaning his few personal belongings with unusual care, arranging items in his quarters with meticulous precision, and spending time in what seemed to be silent farewell conversations with other enslaved individuals. On November 1st, 1845, Josiah Reed completed his letter. The document, written on paper whose source was never identified, consisted of several pages of carefully crafted text that would not surface until its discovery in 1966. The circumstances surrounding both the completion of the letter and Reed's actions immediately afterward would become the subject of intense scrutiny and debate among historians and legal experts for decades to come. What happened next was witnessed by several individuals whose testimonies, though recorded years later, remained remarkably consistent in their essential details. On the evening of November 1st, Reed requested an audience with Marcus Whitmore. This request, delivered through the plantation's established chain of communication, was highly unusual. Enslaved individuals rarely sought direct contact with the plantation owner outside of specific work-related circumstances or disciplinary matters. Whitmore, apparently intrigued by the unprecedented nature of the request, agreed to meet with Reed in the main house library. This room, lined with books that represented knowledge forbidden to those in bondage, would serve as the setting for an encounter that defied the established social order of the antebellum South. According to Whitmore's own account, preserved in a letter he wrote to his brother-in-law several days later, Reed entered the library, carrying what appeared to be a folded document. His demeanor was described as calm but purposeful, lacking any trace of the deference typically expected from enslaved individuals in the presence of their owners. Reed stood silently for several moments, apparently gathering his thoughts, or perhaps his courage. When Reed finally spoke, his words shattered every assumption Whitmore held about the intellectual capabilities of the man standing before him. Reed's speech, as Whitmore later recalled, was articulate and measured, demonstrating a command of language that seemed impossible given his circumstances. More shocking still was the content of what Reed had to say. Reed informed Whitmore that he had composed a letter detailing the systematic violations of human dignity that occurred daily on the plantation. He described specific instances of cruelty, documented the inadequate provisions provided to enslaved families, and outlined the psychological and physical toll of forced labor. But the letter went beyond mere documentation of suffering. Reed had crafted a legal and moral argument against the institution of slavery itself, drawing upon philosophical and religious principles that he should never have been exposed to, let alone mastered. The letter, Reed explained, was not intended for Whitmore or for any local authority who might simply destroy it and punish its author. Instead, Reed had addressed his document to specific members of the United States Congress, including several senators and representatives who were known for their opposition to slavery. He had somehow acquired not only their names, but their official addresses, information that would have been extremely difficult for even educated free individuals to obtain. Whitmore's response to this revelation was a mixture of shock, admiration, and terror. The implications of Reed's actions extended far beyond the boundaries of the plantation. If the letter reached its intended recipients, it could provide abolitionists with detailed, first-hand testimony about the realities of slavery from someone who had experienced it directly. More troubling still, the letter's sophisticated argumentation could undermine claims that enslaved people lacked the intellectual capacity to participate fully in society. Reed then made a request that left Whitmore speechless. He asked his owner to ensure that the letter reached its intended destination. Reed argued that Whitmore, as a white man with access to postal services and social connections, possessed the means to guarantee that the document would not be intercepted or destroyed by local authorities who would certainly oppose its circulation. The audacity of this request was breathtaking. Reed was essentially asking the man who claimed ownership of his body to facilitate an act that could contribute to the destruction of the very system that maintained Whitmore's wealth and social position. Yet Reed presented his request not as a demand or threat, but as an appeal to whatever conscience or sense of justice might exist within his captor. Whitmore's initial reaction was to refuse outright. The practical and legal risks of complying with Reed's request were enormous. Assisting in the distribution of abolitionist materials could result in social ostracism, legal prosecution, and financial ruin. Moreover, allowing an enslaved person to dictate terms to a white plantation owner represented a fundamental challenge to the racial hierarchy that governed Southern society. However, something in Reed's demeanor and the sophisticated nature of his arguments apparently gave Whitmore pause. In his letter to his brother-in-law, Whitmore described spending the remainder of the evening reading Reed's document while its author waited silently in the library. What Whitmore found in those pages would haunt him for the rest of his life. The letter began with a detailed account of Reed's family history, tracing 3 generations of enforced servitude and documenting specific instances of family members who had died due to inadequate medical care, overwork, and malnutrition. But Reed had not written merely to catalogue suffering. He had constructed a carefully reasoned argument that slavery violated both natural law and Christian doctrine, citing specific biblical passages and philosophical principles with a precision that demonstrated extensive, albeit secret, education. More disturbing to Whitmore was Reed's demonstration of knowledge about the political and legal systems that maintained his bondage. The letter included references to specific laws, court decisions, and congressional debates, indicating that Reed had somehow gained access to information about the broader political context of slavery. This knowledge had allowed him to frame his arguments in terms that would be familiar and compelling to his intended audience of federal legislators. Perhaps most unsettling of all was Reed's articulation of a vision for American society in which the principles of equality and freedom proclaimed in the Declaration of Independence would be extended to all inhabitants regardless of race. Reed's argument was not simply emotional or religious in nature, but drew upon the same Enlightenment philosophy that had inspired the American Revolution. He had turned the founding principles of the nation against the institution that held him captive. As Whitmore read through the letter, he found himself confronting uncomfortable questions about the morality of his own actions and the society that had shaped his beliefs. Reed's arguments were not the rantings of an angry man seeking revenge, but the thoughtful observations of an intelligent individual who had been denied basic human rights solely because of the color of his skin. The immediate question facing Whitmore was whether to honor Reed's request or to destroy the letter and punish its author. Either choice carried significant consequences. Complying with Reed's request would make Whitmore complicit in an act that could contribute to the destruction of slavery as an institution. Refusing would mean suppressing what Whitmore had to acknowledge was a powerful and legitimate critique of the system that had enriched his family for generations. After several hours of consideration, Whitmore made a decision that would echo through the decades that followed. He agreed to ensure that Reed's letter reached its intended recipients in Congress, but on one condition. Reed would have to leave the plantation immediately and permanently, forfeiting any claim to remain near his parents and the community that had shaped his entire life. Reed's acceptance of this condition revealed the depth of his commitment to his cause. He was willing to sacrifice his connections to family and community for the possibility that his words might contribute to meaningful change for future generations. The terms of his departure were arranged quickly and quietly, with Whitmore providing basic traveling documents that would allow Reed to move through South Carolina without being immediately identified as a runaway slave. On November 3, 1845, Josiah Reed left the only home he had ever known. His departure was witnessed by several other enslaved individuals who later described the scene as heartbreaking yet somehow inspiring. Reed embraced his parents briefly, spoke quietly to a few close friends, and then walked away from the plantation without looking back. What happened to Reed after his departure remained a mystery for more than a century. Various theories emerged over time, suggesting that he might have reached the north, joined the Underground Railroad, or perhaps been recaptured and sold to another plantation under a different name. None of these theories could be verified, and Reed seemed to vanish from the historical record as completely as if he had never existed. Whitmore, meanwhile, fulfilled his promise with a mixture of determination and dread. He personally carried Reed's letter to Charleston, where he entrusted it to a business associate with connections in Washington. The letter was placed in the federal postal system with instructions that it be delivered directly to the offices of the senators and representatives Reed had identified. The impact of Reed's letter, when it finally reached its intended recipients in late November 1845, was immediate and profound. Several congressmen who received copies were moved to read portions of the document aloud during floor debates, exposing Reed's eloquent arguments to a national audience through newspaper coverage of congressional proceedings. The letter's sophisticated reasoning and emotional power provided abolitionists with exactly the kind of first-hand testimony they needed to counter claims that enslaved people were incapable of intellectual achievement or moral reasoning. Reed's document became a cornerstone of abolitionist argumentation, cited in speeches, pamphlets, and newspaper editorials throughout the North. Southern reaction to the letter's publication was swift and furious. Newspapers throughout the slaveholding states denounced the document as a forgery, claiming that no enslaved person could possibly have produced such sophisticated argumentation. Others acknowledged the letter's authenticity, but argued that Reed represented an exceptional case that proved nothing about the capabilities of enslaved people in general. The political impact of Reed's letter extended far beyond the immediate debates over slavery. The document provided concrete evidence that the institution of slavery was suppressing human potential on a massive scale, lending credibility to arguments that the nation was weakening itself by maintaining a system that prevented talented individuals from contributing to society. Marcus Whitmore faced severe consequences for his role in facilitating the letter's distribution. When his involvement became known through investigations conducted by local authorities, he was socially ostracized by his neighbors and faced financial boycotts that threatened the viability of his plantation. The stress of these pressures, combined with his growing doubts about the morality of slavery, led to what contemporary observers described as a significant deterioration in his mental and physical health. In 1847, Whitmore made the unprecedented decision to free all of the enslaved people on his plantation and to convert his property into a paid labor farm. This decision, influenced at least in part by his encounter with Reed and the letter, made Whitmore one of the few Southern plantation owners to voluntarily abandon the institution of slavery before the Civil War. The freed Reed family members chose to remain on the former plantation, working as paid laborers for the first time in their lives. Thomas and Mary Reed lived to see the end of slavery throughout the United States, though they never learned what had become of their son following his departure in 1845. The original letter written by Josiah Reed was lost for decades following its initial circulation in Congress. Various copies existed, but the handwritten document that Reed had labored over during those October nights in 1845 seemed to have disappeared from the historical record. In 1966, however, the letter resurfaced in the most unexpected circumstances. Workers renovating the basement of the Capitol building in Washington discovered a metal box hidden behind a false wall in a storage area that had apparently been forgotten for decades. Inside the box, along with other historical documents, was Reed's original letter, perfectly preserved and bearing the unmistakable signs of having been written under difficult conditions. The rediscovery of the letter prompted renewed scholarly interest in Reed's story and its significance in American history. Analysis of the paper and ink confirmed that the document had indeed been written in the 1840s, putting to rest any remaining doubts about its authenticity. More importantly, the letter's preservation allowed historians to study Reed's arguments in their complete form for the first time in over a century. Modern analysis of Reed's letter revealed layers of meaning and sophistication that had not been fully appreciated by his original audience. Reed had not merely argued against slavery on moral grounds, but had constructed a comprehensive critique of American society that anticipated many of the arguments that would emerge during the civil rights movement of the 20th century. The letter's influence on the events leading up to the Civil War proved to be more significant than historians had previously understood. Research conducted in the 1970s revealed that Reed's arguments had been cited in private correspondence between key political figures, including some who would later play important roles in the Republican Party's opposition to slavery's expansion. Perhaps most remarkably, evidence emerged suggesting that Abraham Lincoln had been familiar with Reed's letter and had been influenced by its arguments in developing his own position on slavery. While no direct quotes from the letter appear in Lincoln's speeches, several historians have identified striking similarities between Reed's reasoning and Lincoln's later argumentation about slavery's incompatibility with American principles. The mystery of what happened to Josiah Reed after his departure from the Whitmore plantation was never fully resolved, despite extensive research efforts. Some evidence suggested that he had reached Pennsylvania and had become involved in Underground Railroad activities, but this could never be confirmed. Other theories proposed that he had assumed a new identity and had lived out his life in freedom somewhere in the North, but again, no definitive proof emerged. What remained undeniable was the lasting impact of Reed's courage and intelligence on American history. His letter had provided a powerful voice for the voiceless, demonstrating that the institution of slavery was not only morally wrong, but was also depriving the nation of incalculable human talent and potential. In 1968, a small historical marker was installed near the site of the former Whitmore plantation, acknowledging Reed's contribution to American literature and political thought. The marker's inscription read simply, "Josiah Reed, born enslaved 1822, author of a letter that changed American history. His final words echo still." The Reed family's story did not end with Josiah's departure. His parents lived to see their grandchildren born free, and several of their descendants went on to achieve significant success in education, business, and public service. The family preserved oral traditions about Josiah's life and his remarkable act of courage, passing down stories that helped sustain them through the difficult decades that followed the end of slavery. Thomas Reed, Josiah's father, lived until 1871, long enough to witness the ratification of the 15th Amendment guaranteeing voting rights regardless of race. In interviews conducted by local historians shortly before his death, Thomas spoke of his pride in his son's accomplishments and his belief that Josiah's letter had contributed to the great changes that had transformed American society. Mary Read survived until 1873, and in her final years she became something of a local historian herself, sharing stories about life on the plantation and about her son's remarkable act of defiance. Her accounts provided invaluable insights into the daily realities of enslaved life and the ways that families like the Reeds had managed to preserve their dignity and humanity despite the dehumanizing conditions they faced. The broader impact of Read's letter continued to resonate throughout the 19th and into the 20th century. Abolitionist organizations reprinted portions of the document for decades, using Read's words to support their arguments about the intellectual capabilities of African Americans and the moral necessity of ending racial discrimination. During the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, Read's letter gained renewed relevance as activists sought historical precedents for their demands for equality and justice. The document's sophisticated argumentation and its author's willingness to sacrifice everything for his principles provided inspiration for a new generation of civil rights leaders. In 1969, the final year within our historical scope, the Smithsonian Institution acquired Read's original letter for permanent preservation in its collections. The acquisition ceremony was attended by descendants of both the Read and Whitmore families, marking a moment of reconciliation and shared recognition of the document's historical significance. The letter was displayed publicly for the first time in decades, allowing visitors to see firsthand the careful handwriting and thoughtful argumentation that had emerged from the quarters of a South Carolina plantation over a century earlier. The exhibition drew unprecedented crowds, with many visitors expressing amazement that such a powerful and sophisticated document had been produced under conditions of enslavement. Dr. Margaret Washington, one of the historians who had worked to authenticate and preserve Read's letter, spoke at the acquisition ceremony about the document's continuing relevance to American society. She noted that Read's arguments about equality, justice, and human dignity remained as compelling in 1969 as they had been in 1845, and she suggested that his letter continued to challenge Americans to live up to the highest ideals of their founding principles. The mystery of Josiah Read's final years remained unsolved, but his legacy was secure. Through a single act of courage and literary brilliance, he had managed to speak across the centuries, lending his voice to the ongoing struggle for human rights and dignity. As visitors left the Smithsonian that day in 1969, many carried with them a deeper appreciation for the individuals who had sacrificed everything to advance the cause of freedom. Read's letter served as a reminder that the most profound changes in history often begin with the quiet courage of ordinary people who refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. The echoes of that courage continue to resonate today, inspiring new generations to find their own voices and to speak truth to power, just as Josiah Read had done during those October nights in 1845, when he labored by moonlight to craft words that would outlive the system that had sought to silence him forever. His letter stands as testament to the indomitable human spirit and to the power of the written word to transcend the limitations imposed by circumstance and oppression. In the end, Josiah Read achieved a form of immortality that no chains could prevent and no master could control. The acquisition ceremony marked what many believed would be the final chapter in the story of Josiah Read and his remarkable letter. However, in the months following the Smithsonian exhibition, new information emerged that added one last haunting dimension to an already extraordinary tale. In late 1969, A construction crew working on renovations at a small Methodist church in Philadelphia made an unexpected discovery. Behind a loose brick in the church's foundation, workers found a small wooden box containing personal effects and a brief note written in handwriting that matched samples from Reed's original letter. The note, dated simply December 1845, contained only a few lines. "I have found peace in service to others seeking freedom. The letter has reached those who needed to hear its message. My work continues in different forms. May future generations remember that words written in darkness can bring light to the world." This final message suggested that Reed had indeed reached the North and had become involved in Underground Railroad activities, just as some historians had theorized. More significantly, it indicated that he had learned of his letter's impact on congressional debates and had found satisfaction in knowing that his sacrifice had served its intended purpose. The discovery of this final note provided a sense of closure to Reed's story, suggesting that he had lived to see at least the beginning of the changes his letter had helped to inspire. The Methodist church where the note was found had been a known station on the Underground Railroad, lending credibility to the theory that Reed had dedicated his remaining years to helping other enslaved people escape to freedom. Dr. Washington and her colleagues subjected the newly discovered note to the same rigorous authentication process that had been applied to the original letter. Carbon dating, handwriting analysis, and examination of the paper and ink all confirmed that the document was genuine and had indeed been written in the 1840s. The note's placement in the church foundation suggested that Reed had intended it to be discovered eventually, perhaps as a final testament to his life's work. The timing of its discovery, coming just months after the original letter had been placed on permanent display, seemed almost prophetic, as if Reed had somehow orchestrated one final revelation from beyond the grave. With this discovery, the essential elements of Josiah Reed's story were complete. Born into bondage, educated in secret, and driven by an unshakable belief in human dignity, he had risked everything to ensure that his voice would be heard by those with the power to effect change. His letter had indeed contributed to the political developments that would ultimately lead to the end of slavery in America. The full impact of Reed's courage extended far beyond the immediate political sphere. His letter had demonstrated that intelligence, eloquence, and moral reasoning were not limited by race or circumstance, providing powerful evidence against the racist ideologies that had justified enslavement. More importantly, his willingness to sacrifice his personal safety for a greater cause had established a model of principled resistance that would inspire future generations of civil rights activists. As the 1960s drew to a close, Reed's letter continued to attract scholars, activists, and ordinary citizens, seeking to understand the roots of America's ongoing struggle with racial justice. The document served as a bridge between the antebellum period and the modern civil rights movement, demonstrating that the quest for equality had deep historical roots and that progress, while slow, was possible. The Methodist Church in Philadelphia chose to honor Reed's memory by establishing a small museum dedicated to the Underground Railroad and the individuals who had risked their lives to operate it. Reed's final note became the centerpiece of this exhibition, displayed alongside artifacts from other freedom seekers and the abolitionists who had aided them. In the end, Josiah Reed achieved something that had seemed impossible when he began writing by candlelight in those South Carolina slave quarters. He had spoken truth to power with such eloquence and conviction that his words had outlasted the system that had sought to silence him. His letter had become part of the permanent record of American history, ensuring that his voice would continue to be heard by future generations seeking to understand their nation's complex past. The echoes of Reed's courage reverberated through time, reminding each new generation that individual acts of conscience, however small they might seem at the moment, can contribute to transformative social change. His story demonstrated that even under the most oppressive circumstances, the human spirit could find ways to assert its dignity and demand recognition of its fundamental worth. Today, Reed's letter stands as one of the most powerful first-hand accounts of the slavery experience, but more than that, it serves as a testament to the enduring power of words to effect change, and to the courage of those who dare to speak truth regardless of the personal cost. The final words of his letter continue to resonate. The chains that bind the body cannot imprison the mind that seeks truth, nor silence the voice that demands justice. In those words, Josiah Reed had captured not only his own experience, but the eternal struggle of all people seeking freedom and dignity in the face of oppression. His legacy lived on not just in museums and history books, but in the ongoing work of those who continued to fight for justice and equality. The letter he had written in 1845 remained as relevant and powerful in 1969 as it had been on the night he completed it, and it would continue to inspire and challenge readers for generations to come. The story of Josiah Reed reminds us that history is shaped not only by the famous and powerful, but by ordinary individuals who choose to act with extraordinary courage when confronted with injustice. His letter proved that one person, armed with nothing more than determination and the written word, could indeed change the course of history. As the final chapter of this remarkable story came to a close, Reed's voice continued to echo across time, carrying with it the hopes and dreams of all those who had been denied their fundamental human rights. His words served as both a record of past injustices and a call to continued vigilance in protecting the dignity and rights of all people. The silence that had once surrounded the quarters of the Whitmore plantation had been broken forever by a man who refused to accept that his voice did not matter. In breaking that silence, Josiah Reed had ensured that the voices of the countless others who had lived and died in bondage would not be forgotten, and that their struggles would continue to inform and inspire the ongoing quest for human freedom and dignity.